Well, good morning, everyone. As Darcy kind of mentioned, this morning is a little bit of an in-between morning. We'll be between Christmas and New Year's. We've finished our Advent series. We're not quite ready to start our New Year's series, but somebody's still got to get up and say something on a Sunday morning, right? So that's where I find myself. I hope everyone has had a good holiday season so far. We are at a little bit of an in-between, at a pivot point. Christmas is behind us, and we turn our attention to the new year. In the life of the church, that means that we're shifting our focus from the manger and the celebration of Christmas to what's coming in the spring and the celebration of Easter. And our eyes will start to be fixed on the cross and Christ's resurrection. From a holiday season perspective, it means that we're shifting our attention from the Christmas get-togethers to the New Year's Eve celebrations on Tuesday evening. And as we've had the holidays, how many of you have played host this year for a Christmas celebration? How many of you had family Christmas at your place? And how many of you are going to host New Year's Eve? How many of you are doing both? Nobody? There's a couple. Well, bless those who are doing both. I know I couldn't handle that. Honestly, one thing I do love about this time of year is all of these get-togethers. I do really enjoy that the celebration of the holiday season involves getting together at people's homes, getting together with family. And I think that there's really something great about those of us who are willing to open up our homes and welcome others in. We know that sometimes it can be awkward and uncomfortable, and it requires a lot of time and energy. But I think it's really beautiful when people endure all of that and try to provide a place where people can feel relaxed, at ease, and at home. And when we do that cheerfully, I think we demonstrate a part of God's character to one another. And I think we all intuitively understand the beauty of hospitality and that it's a good thing for us to do to welcome others in. But that beauty is amplified even more when the hospitality is directed towards not just our family and our well-known friends, but towards those in need who we don't even know. We are inspired by stories of people who open their doors to strangers. Now, in December of last year, Sharice and I were in Toronto with my family to see a musical, which I'm sure that many of you have seen or at least you've heard about. Come From Away tells the true story of what went on in Gander, Newfoundland in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks. 38 planes were grounded in Gander at that time because the U.S. airspace was closed, and roughly 7,000 people were without a place to stay. And in a display of stereotypical East Coast hospitality, Gander and the surrounding communities managed to house and feed these 7,000 plain people for 5 days. It didn't matter where they had come from, they were welcomed and cared for. And aside from being, in my opinion, just a wildly entertaining show, Come From Away had this unavoidable, inspiring effect as we watched the portrayal of our fellow Canadians showing ridiculous generosity to people that they had never met before, people from all over the world. And something about it just seemed right. And watching it, you couldn't help but hope that that kind of generosity and that heart for hospitality was within you as well. You hoped that you would have had the same reaction that the Newfoundlanders did if you were in their shoes. Because we know that while hosting family and friends is a good thing, there's something different about demonstrating that kind of hospitality to strangers, to people who are vulnerable, to people who otherwise would be without a place. And so this morning we're going to explore this theme of welcoming strangers, and we've got two goals in mind. First, we want to be reminded that welcoming strangers is intertwined with the heart of God, and it's an ancient call for all of his followers. We want to remind ourselves of a vision for hospitality that's not restricted to a season or to a familiar group of people, but it's a practice for the long haul, and it shifts focus to the stranger, to people who don't have a place. And second, we want to be reminded that we welcome not solely out of obligation. We practice hospitality because in the light of the gospel, it just makes sense. Our welcoming strangers is not primarily obedience to a command that we are given, but it's a response to a welcome which we have received. We welcome because we were welcomed first. We are strangers welcoming strangers. And to this end, our scripture for this morning comes from Deuteronomy chapter 10. So just take a moment and flip there if you've got your Bible or the one in front of you in the pew or on your phone. And as you're turning to Deuteronomy chapter 10, starting in verse 12, let's just remind ourselves of the context in which we find ourselves in this passage. So we're jumping into the middle of the history of a particular ethnic group. It's the people of Israel. And we often refer to them as God's chosen people because in ancient times, the Old Testament tells about how God selected them through no merit of their own to be a nation of people through which he would primarily reveal himself to the world. He intended to set them up as a nation that had a culture, it had laws, it had a way of life that showed to the world this is what it is like when God is in charge. And many of us know that over their history, Israel filled that mandate quite imperfectly. But that's a story for another time. Deuteronomy is effectively a set of speeches that's delivered by Moses, the leader of the Israelites, to the people. At this point in their history, he's about to be succeeded by Joshua, who will ultimately lead Israel into Canaan, which is the land that God had promised to the nation of Israel to be their home, to be the place that where they would dwell and where they would establish this theocracy, this nation that was under the rule of God. And 40 years earlier, Moses had delivered to the people in Leviticus this law that would govern their society. It would govern their culture and their relationship with God. But since then, they had been wandering in the wilderness for a generation, waiting to take possession of the promised land. And so in Deuteronomy, Moses is basically doing two things. First, he's recounting Israel's history to the people. He's reminding them of where they've come from. He contrasts their continual failure with God's continual faithfulness. And then second, he's just taking the opportunity to re-explain the law which God had given, the law that would guide their nation to being this nation of people that showed the world what God was like. And so that's the context we find ourselves in as we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 10. And we're just going to start reading in verse 12. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good? Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. So circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and the awesome God who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, you shall serve him and cling to him, and you shall swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen. This is the word of the Lord. So in this summary and exhortation in Deuteronomy, Moses is succinctly reminding the people of who God is, what he's done for them, and what their response should be. In his summary of God's character, we find all of the normal descriptors that we might expect of an ancient deity. It's maybe all the stereotypical descriptors that we expect to find when we talk about the God of the Old Testament. He is the creator in verse 14. In verse 17, he's above all, he's powerful and upright. In verse 20, he is deserving of respect, even fear. And in verse 21, he is praiseworthy and he has done awesome things. But right in the middle, in verse 18, we also see a reminder of his gentle, caring, and fiercely just character. He is the defender of the cause of the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. And what strikes me about that verse in the middle is that this element of his character is not secondary. His love for the marginalized and the vulnerable is as central to his character as is the fact that he created the universe. This is a part of the very essence of his being. And his character is reflected in several specific laws that were passed on to Israel. Later on in Deuteronomy chapter 24, starting in verse 17, we see some of these specific laws that kind of highlight this element of his character. In verse 17, it says, "You shall not pervert the justice due an alien or an orphan, nor take a widow's garment in pledge." And then in verse 19, "When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in your field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the alien and for the orphan and for the widow. When you beat your olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the alien and for the orphan and for the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the alien and for the orphan and for the widow." For the Israelites, here in Deuteronomy, it's literally written into the legislation that they should forego possible profits in order to provide for the vulnerable. God is a provider, he's a supporter, and he's a defender of the weak and marginalized. And these kinds of laws, when we read them in Deuteronomy or in the original giving of the law in Leviticus, they highlight how this element of God's character was to be lived out practically by Israel. In similar passages in the Old Testament that discuss this kind of care for vulnerable people, we see the same three groups listed as listed here: the orphan, the widow, the alien, or the foreigner. And I think we kind of generally understand why the orphan and the widow are groups that are highlighted as vulnerable people. I mean, we can understand how they would be disconnected from normal social and economic protection and security that one would normally find in a family unit, in parents, or in a spouse. And so we easily understand the obligation to take care of our own who find themselves in this situation. But consistently in Scripture, we also see the alien or the foreigner listed alongside the orphan and the widow. And Christine Pohl, the author of a book called Making Room, explains why this is. She writes, "Sojourners or aliens were often landless in an agrarian society where land was usually distributed by inheritance and where access to land was essential to life. Without special attention, resident aliens would be marginal to most Israelite institutions, to extended families, as well as to legal, economic, political, and religious institutions. Their status was precarious, and their well-being depended on the willingness of the community to welcome them into its life. Often powerless and vulnerable to injustice and exploitation, sojourners were frequently grouped with the poor, the widow, and the fatherless in the biblical text." You see, Israel was about to take possession of the land of Canaan, and this land was going to be divided up by tribe, and then it would ultimately be distributed to descendants by inheritance. And so foreigners among the Israelites who belonged to no tribe would have no land and no way to provide for themselves. So not only would they be strangers living in an unfamiliar land, without the social and the cultural structures of their own people, but they would be by default among the most economically vulnerable. But the thing is that them being outsiders or foreigners, it didn't matter at all to God. In the call to care for vulnerable people, they are listed right beside the orphan and the widow. God's call to Israel was to treat the foreigner like one of their own who was in need. They were to defend the orphan, defend the widow, and defend the stranger, because that's what their God did. And they were to have a reflection of his heart and his character ingrained in their culture and practice. You know, whether good or bad, sometimes we kind of have stereotypes of groups of people or nations. We kind of make generalizations. There's things that there's some of these stereotypes that might be accurate and some that are less so. But in general, when we think of groups of people, we kind of have things that come to mind that they're known for. When someone mentions France, you might think of good wine and delicious food. Germans are known for their engineering, and we Canadians are apparently quite polite. Now, I can probably guess at what comes to mind when you think of Newfoundlanders, but if you had seen that musical Come From Away, I'm sure it also reinforced some of those stereotypes, particularly the one that those people are among the kindest, most welcoming, and hospitable folks in Canada. The show portrays the Islanders in an extremely favorable light, and I mean, it's hard not to when you're talking about a community of 10,000 people, or a little less than 10,000 people, just a little bit smaller than Elmira, who pitched in to house 7,000 people for 5 days. You just get the sense when you watch the show that in the mindset of the Newfoundlander, if there's a stranger in your midst who needs a hand and shows up at your door, you do something about it. No questions asked. That's just the kind of people they are. And in a similar fashion, this was the call of the Israelites. With their culture and practice, they were meant to reflect God's heart. They were meant to be a people who were known to care for the vulnerable, who defended the weak, who supported the powerless, who welcomed the stranger. And later on, when Christ came and fulfilled the Mosaic law and established the new covenant, Israel's role as God's ambassador on earth shifted to the Christian church and to us. And with that role came this mantle of being people who were known for welcoming strangers. And we see that confirmed in several places in the New Testament. Both Paul and the writer to the Hebrews urge believers to practice hospitality. And that call was not reserved only to those who felt particularly gifted in that area. It was a call that was meant to be fulfilled by all believers. And Paul even listed it among the qualifications for leaders of the church when he wrote to Titus and to Timothy. And as we read the gospel accounts and the teachings of Jesus, parables like the Good Samaritan in Luke, or the sheep and the goats in Matthew, or when we read the life of the early church in Acts, it's really obvious to us that this call to hospitality, to welcoming the stranger, to providing for one another's needs, to caring for the vulnerable, it all continued well beyond the Old Testament. Because God's heart is for these people, the strangers, the vulnerable, for people that are without a place, that are disconnected. It always has been. We see it in the Old Testament, in the Mosaic Law. The prophets talk about it. The psalmist sings about it. Christ reinforced it in his teaching. And the early church knew that they had to live it out. Because God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And being a part of the people of God, whether as a theocracy in Israel or a part of the community of the Christian church, means reflecting his heart to the world by welcoming others, by being people who are known by their hospitality, just like the Newfoundlanders are known for theirs. Welcoming strangers is intertwined with the heart of God and is an ancient call for all of his followers. And that's the first thing we wanted to be reminded of this morning. The second reminder for us also comes out of that passage in Deuteronomy, and is this: welcoming strangers is not primarily obedience to a command we are given, but a response to a welcome we have received. You see, it would be very easy for me to get up here this morning and basically say something to the effect of, God is hospitable, you should be hospitable, here are 5 ways to be hospitable. And there might be merit in a sermon like that. And there's an element of truth in that. And honestly, it would probably, for most of us, feel very clear-cut and practical, and we'd enjoy that. But the thing is, it would be detached from what God teaches as the primary motivator for us welcoming the stranger. We welcome because we were welcomed first. We are strangers welcoming strangers. If you look back to Deuteronomy chapter 10, and let's reread verses 18 and 19. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. So show your love for the alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. That phrase, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt, or something like it, is repeated in several places throughout the Mosaic Law. And with it, Moses is reminding the people of where they had come from. You see, for basically their entire history, they had been strangers. They had been people without a place. They were descendants of Abraham, who had departed from his father's home and from his family and basically went out on his own, only trusting in faith that God would come through on his promise and would multiply his offspring and give him a land to dwell in. But eventually they were driven to Egypt by a famine, like refugees. And then things eventually went bad there. They were forced into slavery. It was after 400 years that God finally intervened, ultimately not because of their own merit, but because of his sovereign grace. He then rescued them through an incredible set of miracles, which included parting the Red Sea so that they could walk right through it and escape the grasp of the Egyptians. And then, because of their disobedience, which is a story for another time, they spent 40 years as nomads wandering in the wilderness with no permanent home. And now, finally, the Israelites were about to cross the Jordan and take possession of the land of Canaan, which God had promised them as their home. And right as they do, Moses is urging them, don't forget, you have not always been faithful, but God has been. You have not always had a place, but God never forgot you. He did not abandon you those 400 years in Egypt. He rescued you. And as you enter this land, remember that you know what it is like to be a foreigner, an alien, a stranger, a refugee. But God kept you. He sustained you. He welcomed you. And so let that drive you to obey and welcome others. And the principle of that admonition of Moses to the Israelites can resonate with us as well if we just give it a little bit of thought. For those of us who know Christ and who have trusted in his saving work, we are a part of his family. We have a home with him. And even if we don't know what it is like in this life to be a stranger in maybe an economical or a social sense, we should know what it's like to be a stranger on a spiritual level. Because just like the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and they were without hope for hundreds of years, so we were enslaved in our sin with no hope of rescuing ourselves. In Ephesians 2, Paul writes, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. And so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and are members of God's household." Christian teaching is clear. The human condition is that we are spiritual strangers. We are people without a place. We are disconnected from the basic relationship that gives us a secure place in the world. We all desired belonging, a feeling of at-homeness, of completeness and peace. But we, like nomads, we wander here and there trying to find a home everywhere except for with our Creator. And we end up enslaved in all of those places that we thought would feel like home. But in Christ, God came and rescued us. He welcomed us into his household where we would find true belonging. And if that's how Christ welcomed us through no merit of our own, only by his sovereign grace, how could we not welcome others? We welcome because we were welcomed first. We are strangers welcoming strangers. A number of weeks ago, I had the privilege of meeting an author by the name of Kent Annan. Last year, he released a book that's called You Welcomed Me, Loving Refugees and Immigrants Because God First Loved Us. And in it, he tells the story of a Ugandan named Isaac. In the 1980s, Isaac fled from Uganda to Sudan as a refugee. He was leaving behind some civil unrest in his home country. And then later in the 1980s, when he returned back to Uganda, he and a few fellow believers founded an organization called Here is Life. And they were dedicated to sharing the love of Christ and to promoting development in northern Uganda, in a district called the Yumbi district. In 2017, just a couple years ago, Uganda received more refugees than any other place in the world. And many of them went to this Yumbi district in northern Uganda. These refugees were from South Sudan, the same country where Isaac had fled some 30 years previous. The South Sudanese are currently fleeing civil conflict which broke out in 2013. And to date, Uganda has welcomed nearly 1.1 million Sudanese people. And Isaac, who's now over 70, and the people in his organization find themselves working to serve these refugees by providing counseling services, building latrines, and providing child education support within the refugee settlements. And as I read Kent's book, a simple quote from Isaac struck me, as just in passing, he indicated why the decision to help the South Sudanese refugees was a relatively simple one. He said, "If your life is comfortable, then maybe it's hard to receive all these refugees who come. But for us, we had to flee to South Sudan before. We were helped, and so we're ready to help when they come to us." And it's really that simple. Isaac and the Ugandans remembered what it was like to be refugees. They welcomed because they were welcomed first. And in the same way, the Israelites were to welcome foreigners because they knew what it was like to be a people without a place, trapped in another nation. And in the same way, we are to welcome strangers because we know that we were once strangers to God, redeemed only by his grace. Our welcoming strangers is not only obedience to a command we are given, but it's a response to a welcome which we have received. We welcome because we were welcomed first. We are strangers welcoming strangers. You see, if we approach welcoming the stranger as only a command to be obeyed in order to fulfill our duty or in order to earn God's favor, which we already have, we're going to burn ourselves out trying to save the world on our own steam. Instead, if we want to be a people continually marked by hospitality, known for welcoming the stranger, then we need the truth of this gospel and Christ's welcome to us and the overwhelming generosity of God to affect our hearts and drive our obedience. And so we should make it a practice to reflect. This week, you might be taking some time to, as it's a natural time of year to do so, to just reflect on the year gone by. And as you do, maybe take some time to consider the ways in which you're not a person without a place any longer. How has God provided for you physically, emotionally, economically, spiritually? Remember that we haven't earned anything in this life. We are a vapor, and every good and perfect gift is from the Father above. If we are a people with a place, if we are no longer strangers, in whatever sense that means, it's because of his grace and his grace alone. Let gratitude for that generosity of his soak your heart and rejoice that because of Christ's life, his death, and his resurrection, that you are no longer a stranger or an alien, but you are a member of God's household. Let that truth sustain your drive to welcome others. And if we are going to be a people marked by hospitality, known for welcoming the stranger, we also have to make it a practice to recognize. We must make a habit of looking outward and recognizing the strangers that are in the spaces around us. We must practice identifying who they are. Fundamentally, they're just people without a place, people who are disconnected in our world from the structures and the relationships that give them belonging and give them security. And sometimes those strangers, they're going to be very easily recognizable. They may actually be a foreigner, an immigrant, or a refugee in need of some level of economic support or social connection. But other times, they're going to be far harder to identify. And it's going to require putting yourself out there, having a few conversations, and getting to know some people. But together, let's be a people who are willing to look outward into our communities, look for the strangers, to take some risks, and find them among us. We also need to learn to recognize ourselves in the strangers. We need to recognize their shared humanity with us. We have to see them as mothers and fathers and sons and daughters, brothers and sisters. They're gifted and capable, giving life their best shot, yet they're also imperfect sinners. They're humans just like us. Recognizing ourselves in strangers and in their situations, it means having a heart that says, that could be me, or that was me, and then extending grace towards them. And finally, we need to practice recognizing Jesus in the stranger. You know, Christ began his life as someone without a place. I mean, there was no room for him in the inn. And then his family had to flee to Egypt like refugees to escape the king's grasp. And later in life, he described himself as having no place to lay his head. He was well acquainted with the life of a stranger. And in Matthew 25, the passage of the sheep and the goats, Jesus says to those who are on his right, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me." In some mysterious way, it's possible for Jesus himself to come and be present when we serve the stranger. When we serve them, we serve Christ himself. That should drive us to a heightened sense of urgency in our service, but also to a heightened sense of the dignity and the respect that we must show to the strangers we interact with. And if we are going to be a people marked by hospitality, known for welcoming the stranger, it's also going to require a response with practical action. Now, I know that the practical act of showing hospitality can be somewhat daunting if we let it be, but it doesn't have to be if we remember a few key things. So first, being a stranger at its basic level is just being a person without a place. It's about lacking a connection to something that we need, whether it's physically, emotionally, or spiritually. So in practice, welcoming the stranger is primarily and simply about restoring that connection and making someone feel at home, at ease, accepted, and cared for. It's not always about giving 7,000 people a place to stay for 5 days. Sometimes it's about saying hello and trying to hold a conversation with someone that no one else is willing to. Second, it's important to remember that as with anything, the practice of welcoming strangers will come easier for some than it will for others, but it's necessary for all of us. One author put it this way: for some, hospitality is as natural as breathing. For others, the practice must be acquired. For all, the gift must be nurtured. And full disclosure, I'm in the camp of those for whom the practice has to be acquired. I have to work at it. And I have to consistently remind myself that the development of that habit is a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's a series of small, simple decisions in attitude and action. And it can start with just a kind word rather than a gourmet meal. Because I want to be able to practice hospitality consistently over my life in a way that's going to endure. And as we think about action, in general terms, we can just think about it as two simple things. Welcoming strangers is about making time and making space. We have to learn to slow down and create time that allows for interruption by strangers so that we can give our full attention, have a meaningful interaction, and welcome them with dignity rather than distraction. And maybe that just starts with slowing down in the foyer on a Sunday morning. But eventually it grows towards taking things off of our calendar or off of our task list in order to give ourselves a buffer in life to be interrupted. However we do it, we need to cultivate in our approach to life and our walk an approach that says to the stranger, I have time for you. And practicing hospitality also means making space for strangers to feel welcomed, included, at home, at ease, and secure. And that can be a very real physical space in your homes, a guest room, a seat at the dinner table. Those spaces don't have to be extravagant or perfect. It's not about entertaining. It's about creating a place for people who just might not have one. Creating space can also mean leaving room within our communities, within our church, our social circles, our life groups, for strangers to be invited in and welcomed. Again, all to the end of creating a place of belonging for those who may otherwise be disconnected. Now, in all of that, we have to do these things and respond, not forgetting that there are appropriate boundaries. There are seasons in life, there are limited resources, and we are finite, and we have to be people who recognize our own need for rest and renewal. And we also have a primary responsibility of care towards our families, and we must consider their well-being and needs as we seek to look after the needs of others as well. But we are called to be strangers welcoming strangers. And each of us are going to have to work out the details of what that looks like in our own lives. But make no mistake, it's not going to be easy and comfortable all the time. And it will require sacrifice. But so did Christ's welcome to us. And so, as this year kind of draws to an end, may we find time to reflect on God's good provision in our lives. May we celebrate together that He is our Redeemer. He's the one who chased us down when we were far off, who took us as foreigners and aliens and made them a part of His family. May we learn to recognize the strangers in our midst, to see our mutual humanity, and to treat them with the dignity and respect that we would treat our very own Lord if He were our guest. And may we respond in such a way that makes us a people known for our hospitality and which reflects the heart of God, who the psalmist writes about in Psalm 146. How blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord his God, who made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, who keeps faith forever, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets the prisoner free. The Lord opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord raises up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord protects the strangers. He supports the fatherless and the widow, but he thwarts the way of the wicked. The Lord will reign forever.